right, welcome everybody to this final event of the Fabian Society for 2021. It's titled Too Much Money, How Wealth Inequalities Are Disrupting New Zealand, or Aotearoa New Zealand, I should say, and by Max Rashbrooke, who's here to give us a presentation on his excellent book, and also with Dr. Joe Spratt from Program Manager, Program Director for Oxfam, also a member along with me and others of the Tax Justice Aotearoa Network, which was set up a couple of years ago. And of course, knowing something about wealth and how wealth is distributed in Aotearoa New Zealand is crucial if we are to be able to do anything sensible about our tax system. And I have to say that Max has done us all a great service in outlining and doing the hard work of trying to give us a sense of how wealth is distributed in New Zealand, because it is not an easy task. And I remember asking a couple of our distinguished social scientists a few years ago to do that work, and they told me how hard it was. So Max, thank you very much for that. And as I said, it's crucial if we're to understand how wealth is actually distributed, and then give us a chance to see what we might be able to do about that. So with no further ado, please welcome Max Rashbrooke. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou, ngā mihi nui, ko Max Rashbrooke toku ingoa, no ingarangi oku tipuna. I tae mai o ko tipuna ki Aotearoa i te tau 1843. E noho ana o ki te whanganui a tāra i tupiu ake o ki te whanganui a tāra. Ko tēnei taku mihi ki ngā tangata whenua o te rohe nei. Nō reira tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you everyone for joining me this evening. Thank you to everyone joining us in person. Thank you to everyone joining us on the live stream. Thank you for coming along to a talk about wealth disparities, which, as Mike has mentioned, is very much based on this book that I've just published, Too Much Money. Now, I am imagining that this is a fairly educated audience, and many of you will be familiar with quite a lot of the narrative around economic inequality in this country, and you may be thinking, well, you know, what is there new to learn? And so what I want to do tonight is, I guess, pull out three main sort of themes or ideas from the book, which I think are new, or at least new presentations of things. As Blaise Pascal once said when he was criticised for reworking old material, he said, people say that nothing in this book is new, but the arrangement of the material, at least, is new. So there is that. And then also there are things that I'm talking about which aren't new, but which we haven't talked about for a long time in this country. Now, there is a brief pause while I work out what I've done with the clicker. Here we go. And so the first of the three things that I think is new to this narrative in this book is just around the history of wealth inequality itself in this country. And I'm talking here very specifically about wealth in the sense of the economic store of assets, the things that we own in the shape of housing and investments and vehicles and cash in the bank, the converse of which, of course, is debts. And very often what I'll be talking about here is net worth, so assets minus debts. And that's wealth as an economic resource as distinct from income. Now, income inequality is very important, of course, and that's income is what we use to get through the day-to-day. But if income is the present, then wealth is the future. Wealth is what we use to plan for the future. It's what gives us confidence. It gives us a sense of a stake in our society, the knowledge that we can ride out tough times if they come our way. And so it's very important to know how wealth, economic wealth, is distributed throughout a country. And so in the book, I tell, I think, in greater detail than has ever been done previously, the history of wealth inequality in Aotearoa New Zealand going back at least to 1890. And that's part of the reason why I've started the slides with this particular picture. This is from a house that was completed around about 1890. It's called Burnside. It's about 20 minutes inland from Oamaru. And it was built, well, the funding of it came from John Reid, who was one of New Zealand's wealthiest men at the time. He had built a very lavish house nearby for himself that was called Ellerslie. And this was a house that he had built for his son, John Forrester Reid. And it is, quite a handsome house. And undoubtedly the most distinctive feature of it is the octagonal Great Hall, of which this is a picture. So this huge, very beautiful, very grand space, kind of sprung floor underneath, sort of church-style clerestory rose windows around the top. And as its current owners, who run it as a B&B, acknowledged to me when I interviewed them last year, it is a real statement about inequality. It's a statement in itself about the haves and the have-nots. Because, of course, at that time, sorry, I'm having this is not. Sorry, this is not going in the order I expected. Right. Okay, we're back. So the wealth inequality at that time was really quite extreme. In the 1890s, as you can see, the wealthiest 1% of New Zealanders, which would have been a really tiny, really small handful of people at that point, owned 65% of all the wealth in the country. And unsurprisingly, this was essentially a group of Pākehā men, much of whose wealth was founded on the dispossession of Māori, especially in the South Island. A lot of these people would have been the great sort of run holders, the great sheep lords, the owners of vast tracts of the South Island. Now you sort of move forward a bit in time, and you can see that by the 1930s, that share was significantly low. I mean, still quite disproportionate, but vastly lower than it had been in the 1890s. And that was thanks to a number of things: the Liberals sort of bursting up the great estates, compulsorily purchasing them, the introductions of various kinds of taxes, including estate taxes, and indeed income taxes, and of course the effects of One World War and the Great Depression. Then you start to see the story that we're probably all familiar with, of the decrease in economic inequality that continued throughout the post-war period, driven by the kinds of social democratic policies that a lot of people in this room will be familiar with. Widespread state house building, of course, but also very strong trade union movement, which won a large share of corporate revenue for its members, high income tax rates up around the 60% mark, also all kinds of forces like that. And that drove the concentration of wealth down to the point where in the 1960s, the wealthiest 1% had 18% of all wealth, and by the mid-80s, probably around about 16%. Now that figure is in italics because by that stage, the data source, and this comes back to some of the points that Mike was making about the difficulties of keeping tabs on these things, the data source for all these figures have been basically inheritance taxes. Because when you tax something, you know quite a bit about where it is. By the 1980s, those taxes had started to become riddled with exemptions and were starting to become not as useful as a data source. People were starting to use trusts. People were starting to find various ways of avoiding those taxes. So that figure may or may not be accurate, but it's consistent with the wider picture. What, of course, then happens post about 1985, and again, this will be a familiar story to a lot of people, is we have the fourth Labour government and its introduction of sort of hyper-individualistic, pro-market policies that really wound back a lot of the economic progress of the post-war period. Now, of course, it's important not to see that post-war period, 1950 to 1980, as some kind of paradise. Of course, it was a time of very limited opportunities for large swathes of New Zealand, particularly for women who had fewer employment opportunities, for Māori, for Pacifica people who were facing dawn raids. It's important not to be nostalgic about that past, but there were real achievements in the broad sense of lower economic inequality. What of course happened in the 80s was, pretty well guaranteed to increase those concentrations of wealth at the upper end. So policies like reducing the top income tax rate from 66 to 33%, doing away with inheritance taxes and eventually gift taxes, a real assault on the union movement, which reduced its coverage from about 70% of the workforce to 17%, and certainly under some governments, particularly in the 1990s, the abandonment of any meaningful building of state housing, or indeed any sort of real regulation and shaping of the housing market in an egalitarian way. And so what that then shows up in is post-2000s, a significant increase in the concentration of wealth amongst the wealthiest New Zealanders. The figures, the raw figures, you note that up top that says that these are adjusted figures. The raw figures would tend to suggest that inequality now, that wealth concentration, is about the same as it was in the 60s. But the problem is that our current data source, because we don't tax wealth, because we don't tax inheritances, we have to rely instead on household surveys, which the very wealthy are extremely reluctant to take part in. Thus the phenomenon known as the shy wealthy, which is an international phenomenon. It's one which David Parker is currently trying to correct by writing to New Zealand's wealthiest individuals and telling them that he would like to have some data from them in the same way that he gets data from the rest of the country. They are so far not very keen on this. One of them commented anonymously to the Herald that they were minded not to comply, not least because the fine for non-compliance was $15,000, which is, quote, a night out on the town, unquote. So these are the problems of even trying to know where we are. However, what we can do is take the household data and then add onto it data from the rich list, which is a moderately reliable source of income, or we can look at the income that wealthy people declare from their wealth, so the dividends that they declare, the rent that they declare, and from that reverse estimate how much wealth they have, and that allows you to correct the figures for the fact of the shy wealthy. And so what you see is that there's been a significant increase in concentrations of wealth, as you would expect, post the mid-1980s. Certainly not to the point where we've gone back to the 1890s and the Victorian period, but we have unwound a lot of the progress that had been won over 100 years or so. And so that brings us to the present day. And just before I go on, it's always interesting to think about one's own position in the story. And of course, this is the point of talking about inequality, not just poverty. Poverty can be sort of pushed aside a little bit as something that happens to other people. Inequality is a story about all of us and our relationships to each other and how much we have compared to other people. And is that distribution fair? So now this is data from 2018, and it just shows you how much you had to be in the various, on the sort of rungs of the wealth ladder, as it were, how much you would need to be in various groups. Now the, sort of $860,000 to be in the wealthiest 10th may seem a bit low in a country where the average house price is over $1 million. But firstly, this is net worth, as I said at the start, so it's assets minus debts. And because a lot of people have such large mortgages, actually there's not that many people who have $1 million of housing wealth outright. Also, this is data from 2018. And a couple of things have happened since then, notably an extraordinary acceleration in house prices. But at least it gives you a feel for where things were more or less in 2018, needing to have about $4 million, and probably more than that actually, given the shy wealthy effect, to be in the wealthiest 1%. Now there's huge amounts of data in the book, and I certainly won't go through all of it here. Just want to highlight a couple of things. One of these, this is the wealth of people in the 1%. So as I said, you have to have about 4 million to get into that category. On average, someone in that category had about $7 million. I mean, bearing in mind, of course, that you have people with far more than that. And a couple of things is worth noting. One is shares are a very big proportion of their wealth. The wealthiest 1% have 70% of all the shares in New Zealand, which is an interesting thought in light of, you know, the ideas of the 1980s about wealth being distributed equally and building a share-owning holding society and all these kinds of things. That really hasn't happened. But of course, the most obvious thing from this graph is the huge amount of wealth that's held in trusts at the upper end. Housing, for all that it's a big focus around inequality at the moment, is pretty negligible actually at the upper end as a form of wealth, although of course some of that trust wealth will also be housing wealth. But it's notable just how much of that wealth is held in trusts. And given all the traditional concerns about trusts, the way that they can be used to minimise tax bills or get access to rest home subsidies for which people shouldn't really be eligible, or hide assets from their creditors and their spouses, that is a finding of particular interest. And does suggest, you know, one way among many that the wealthy have to get out of some of the obligations that the rest of us have. And of course, worth noting that wealth inequality doesn't affect everyone equally. On whatever measure, either median or mean, you choose to use, wealth for what stats calls people of European descent, Pākehā, is significantly higher than for other ethnicities, notably than for Māori and Pacifica. So it's huge wealth inequalities in this country amongst the 1%, and you know, even as you go up the spectrum, right, when you're looking at the rich list, some work that Tim Hazeldine from Auckland and I have done has shown that the amount of wealth that's in the rich list has risen from the equivalent of about 1% of GDP, 6% of GDP in the 1980s to about 21% today. So a huge increase in wealth amongst sort of the hyper wealthy, the 0.01%, if you will. And that wealth is increasingly dynastic. Of the fortunes in the rich list, according to the work that Tim and I did, well over a third of them are actively dynastic, in the sense that the fortunes have been either inherited from a previous generation or control of the firm is being passed on to the next generation. So a third of them are actively dynastic. And of course, in virtually all of those fortunes, there will be inheritances and just sort of money being passed down and through. And that kind of intergenerational effect is, of course, crucial to the second major thing that I want to talk about, which I think is distinctive in the book, and that is trying to bring discussions of class and class divisions back into the mainstream of New Zealand discussion. Now, the quote here is a very interesting one. It's from New Plymouth in the 1850s, and it is someone writing someone else talking about marriage that someone has made locally. Sophie Cuttress has married Dr. White of the 65th Regiment. It's all very Jane Austen. She improved her status to the extent of being able to snub all the folk that had snubbed her and her sisters. And then I love this bit, and I hear she avails herself considerably of her privilege. Now, you may, depending on your te reo, you may have noticed that in the opening I said that my ancestors arrived in this country from England in 1843. This letter is in fact written to one of my ancestors, J.C. Richmond, when he was living in New Plymouth in 1855. So, and the thing about this quote is that, you know, it is probably to some extent a quote about wealth inequality. I mean, Sophie Cuttress is probably making herself wealthier. But what's very obvious is that it's not principally actually a quote about wealth inequality, or certainly not only. It's about social status. It's about people's ability to look down on other people or to be looked down on, and about reversing those situations. And so one of the things I do in the book is I develop a bit of a narrative about class in New Zealand. And I sort of start that narrative, and of course it's a highly contested term. I started from a fairly simple basis, we have the story of wealth inequality. And so there are huge wealth inequalities in New Zealand, and some people have vastly more wealth than others. The wealthiest 1% owns a quarter of the country, as you've seen. And then, of course, what happens with that in a sort of very class-divided society is that wealth buys all sorts of other opportunities and advantages. It buys other goods, as we might say. So you can think about housing, wealth buying better housing, for instance, and housing in specific locations. In particular, housing in the zones for the most desirable schools. Now, those schools don't, on the evidence, actually teach any better than low decile schools, but they allow one to ensure that one's children are making certain connections even from an early age. And they also set your children on the path to certain desirable careers, because research done by the Herald a few years ago shows that New Zealand universities in particular, the courses deemed most prestigious, so law and medicine and engineering and that kind of thing, recruit disproportionately from the wealthiest schools. Over a period of years, when Canterbury took 2,000 students into its engineering program, one of them was from a Decile 1 school. Same period of time, Vic took, I think, about 1,400 students into its law program, 8 of them from Decile 1 high schools. So there's this huge advantage in going to wealthier schools in terms of career track opportunities. That, of course, then leads to higher incomes. Wealth also buys a certain kind of status and influence. It buys things like the ability to donate to political parties, which I'll talk more about later on. So it buys all these kind of forms of influence and position. And, of course, increasingly, those things are intergenerational. I mean, that story that I've told you about schooling is intergenerational. Data that I've found on spending on education shows that wealthy families can and do afford to spend about 5 times as much on their children's education as poorer families can. So there are these profoundly different opportunities starting to emerge. There are also differences, I think, there are disparities in people's kind of standing, their cultural capital, if you like. There's sort of cultural knowledge and tastes and beliefs and attitudes. And as some of you will be familiar with, the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu talked a lot about this sort of cultural capital being as important an inheritance as cash in the bank or inheriting a house, because knowledge of sort of what are deemed the legitimate ways of behaving and thinking are things that you can convert into social networks, into career opportunities, things that you can use to distinguish yourself from other people to buttress your position. And they are things which can also make other people feel inferior. And just on that note, in the book, as well as all the facts and figures, I interview a whole lot of people about their lives and about how, and I interview people from sort of the richest to the poorest, and I interview them about what wealth and class have meant in their lives. And there's a quote from a guy called Pete, who's in his 50s and has been homeless most of his life. And he talks about the way that rich people have looked down on me. You know, they look at your appearance and the way you dress. They'd have looked right over my head. They can't wait to get away from you because you are not on their level. You know, so again, this isn't just about wealth. This is about status. This is about cultural capital. This is about certain ways of dressing and appearing that are either sort of used as a form of wealth, as a way to legitimate your status, and also used to make other people feel inferior. Now, another interview I did was with someone who I will call Michael, although that's not his real name, and he's not one of the major interviews in the book, but I do briefly in the book use a little bit from an interview I did with him. And he was the son of a very wealthy man, and he was talking about how his father had a private trust. Because we were quite late on in the interview, I decided to go there, and I said, so how much did you inherit from your father? Because this man had spent the entire sort of 2-hour interview basically denying that he had any form of privilege whatsoever, even though he had gone to King's Prep, then to King's, and then started in the family firm But no, I was treated just like everyone else, he told me. And I got a bit fed up with this, so I said, so how much did you inherit? He said, it wasn't large. Classic interview technique, just in case any of you want to know this, sometimes just don't say anything, because people fill spaces. People hate pauses, particularly New Zealanders. It's very awkward. People don't like it. So I just said nothing, whereupon he said, millions, not tens of millions. Which is just a demonstration of how, it is very funny, but it's also, when you stop and think about it, in an awful way, quite explicable, and that because of class dynamics. So this is someone who has grown up amongst people who inherited tens of millions, not millions of dollars. He is reflecting the... Sorry? He feels relatively deprived. Exactly. This is the milieu in which he is living, and because of the increasing social segregation and class divisions in New Zealand, he lives surrounded by people who are very like him. And so from his point of view, this is a completely logical statement. And that's a wider phenomenon, and that tells you quite a lot of things about these sort of class distinctions. One of which is, the more divided we become as a society, the more we just lose touch with how the other half lives. And therefore, the lower the social cohesiveness of our society, the weaker our ability to come together, to actually understand each other, to know each other, and to resolve common problems. Because if we don't know what's going on in each other's lives, how can we even, meaningfully vote on laws or vote on parties if we don't know how they're going to affect everyone else in the country? So there are very strong, system-level effects of these levels of inequality. But there's also very direct personal effects. Because if you sort of wrap together everything I've been saying about class, what you basically have is a story about some people having much more wealth than others, that wealth allowing them to buy a whole range of advantages in housing and education and status and political power that other people don't have, and then passing those advantages onto their children in ways that sort of hoard opportunity around certain families and exclude from opportunity other families. And so this gives you this is why, I care about wealth inequality in the first place. This is why I care about class divisions, because ultimately it has such a profound effect on the opportunities that people have, and it is so destructive of the idea that people might actually have equal opportunities. And by equal opportunities, I mean opportunities to lead decent, meaningful, rich and fulfilling lives, in harmony with people's communities and in harmony with the planet. And the evidence for this is reasonably strong. If you look at, for instance, the extent to which your income as an adult can be predicted from what your parents earned, in the sort of developed world there's quite a range, and it's very connected to how unequal your society is. In the US, which is an extremely unequal society, half of your income can be predicted from what your parents earned. So essentially, half of your income is predetermined. There's a massive transferal of advantage and indeed disadvantage across the generations, and nothing even remotely resembling equal opportunity given the different starts in life that children get. In a very equal country like Denmark, the amount of your income that you can predict from what your parents earned is 15%. So it's not nothing, but it's vastly lower than in the US. There's very little, comparatively speaking, transfer of advantage and disadvantage across the generations, because the wealth and income, well, certainly the income inequalities aren't that great to start off with, and there's very good public services that redress any inequalities that do exist. In New Zealand, again, we don't have great data, but we are probably somewhere in between. Best estimate is, as a New Zealander, about 30% of your income can be predicted from what your parents earned. So, one of the most important choices you can make is to make sure that you chose the right parents, basically, as the joke has it. And so that's the thing. This world of this country of very significant wealth inequalities, and I think increasingly significant socioeconomic and class disparities, is one in which people have profoundly different and unfair access to the opportunity to lead a good life. And that is obviously deeply concerning. And so that brings me on to the last point, which is about solutions. Now, before we do, I just thought as a nice contrast, I showed you a picture earlier of a very, well, by New Zealand standards, ancient, wealthy house. This is a much more modern version. This is on Paretai Drive in Auckland, and at the time it was the most expensive house built in New Zealand, built, I believe, for the now disgraced financier Mark Hodgson, and it's very lavish, as you can see. The picture says tennis court surface, artist's impression, but I did go for a wander around Paretai Drive one day, and I can confirm you that it is a real thing. It is in fact there. So that's a contrast. Well, that's a similarity actually with the past, but it's a contrast with another form of the past. And this picture in the background, as some of you will know already, will have guessed already, is the first ever State House in Miramar. The one with the famous picture of Michael Joseph Savage carrying in the furniture, a state house that is now, good news, worth over $1 million. Isn't that positive? Possibly not. Anyway, but it's a nice reminder, you know, as I said, of a past for which we shouldn't be totally nostalgic because it was far from perfect, but which nonetheless represented some significant achievements in terms of reducing economic disparities. When it comes to the solutions to these problems that we now face, broadly speaking, I divide them into two categories. And there's a conceptual thing here, but I think it's important just to dwell on it briefly. I think we need to both reduce wealth inequalities at source, so reduce the disparity between rich and poor, reduce that excessive concentration of wealth at the top, and ensure that average people have a much greater stake in their country. But we also need to take steps that prevent the mechanism I just talked about of people translating their wealth into access to other goods, into other opportunities. We need to both reduce wealth disparities at source and block people from exchanging wealth for significantly better education, significantly better influence over politics, significantly better access to healthcare, and so on and so forth. And so that's how I've organised these two lots of solutions. So, firstly, going to the source and trying to redress wealth inequality. I'm in favour of ideas like a kids KiwiSaver. You know, enrol every child at birth in KiwiSaver, have a kickstart, have some incentives for parents to save up to a modest amount, provide direct injections into those accounts for the children as a beneficiary, families who realistically have no ability to save. Create these kinds of schemes so that poor children, when they hit 18, will have access to some kind of capital, some kind of stake, economic stake in their society that does something to even out the fact that other children will be receiving sizable inheritances from their parents. I also think we need to change the risks and rewards for entrepreneurship. We see it mostly as an individual exercise here. You know, if it goes badly, you as the individual bear all the risks. You get dumped back on the unemployment benefit of $315 a week. If it goes well, you get to keep all the rewards, pretty much. But fundamentally, entrepreneurship, just like everything else, relies on collective goods. It relies on all the stuff that taxes pay for, driving on public roads and using the public education and health system and all these kinds of things. And it's in all of our interests that people take risks. So I would support, you know, more generous payments that cushion the shock of business failure, but also mechanisms like higher taxes and maybe share options for employees that mean that the rewards of entrepreneurial success are also more evenly distributed. I also think we need to do things that restore ordinary working people's share of corporate revenue, which has fallen massively over the last few decades. I think fair pay agreements are a good start, but won't go far enough. In the book, I talk about options like the union default idea that's being proposed by Mark Harcourt at the University of Waikato, that union membership operate a bit like KiwiSaver. You're automatically enrolled in it. If you don't want to be part of a union, you have to opt out And that kind of nudge, of course, would preserve people's freedoms, freedom of association or non-association, while encouraging more people to join a union. I think we need a renewed push on state housing. It's fantastic that the government is now building something in the order of 2,000 state houses a year after near total neglect under national. But adjusted for population, the first Labour government was probably building tens of thousands of houses a year, and we need to think about how we scale that up. Finally, of course, to pay for all of this and to reduce the unjust accumulations of wealth at the upper end, we need to do something about the taxation of wealth. I'm not sort of particularly fixed on any one way. The most important fact about New Zealand is that we currently do it no way. We are a real outlier among developed countries in the sense that when you look at the suite of options for taxing wealth or things related to wealth, which includes capital gains taxes, land taxes, property taxes, inheritance taxes, gift taxes, straightforward wealth taxes, sort of stamp duties that are paid on house sales, we don't use any of them, except rates at the local level. You know, in more than any other developed country, we have let our wealthiest citizens off from, you know, any, well, really meaningful tax obligations. As a result, and this is switching a little bit between wealth and income, but inland revenue research has shown that when you look at the wealthiest New Zealanders, those with over $50 million, 40% of them are paying less than 10% of their income in tax. So a very large chunk of New Zealand's wealthiest people pay less of their income in tax than someone on the minimum wage. Because there's all sorts of ways to avoid tax, and they take a lot of their income as capital gains, which of course we have elected not to tax in this country. So whatever we do about it, I mean, whatever we're doing about wealth inequality, we have to find some way of taxing wealth at the upper end. As well as these ways of redressing inequalities at source, as I said, you need to deal with the exchanges, the way that people transfer the wealth that they have into other kinds of advantages. Now, the ideas here include things like clamping down on political donations, which are, of course, a way that if you have large sums of money, you can use to get access to politicians and then indeed influence them. The government has just come out with proposals which I think are sensible to make sure that a lot more donations have someone's name attached to them publicly so that we know who they are, but they're not yet talking about putting a hard limit on how much you can donate to a political party, even though in Canada, you know, pretty comparable modern democracy, you can only give about $1,500 a year to a political party. Here you could, and people have, given $1.5 million, and there's no curbs on that. So we need to be doing something about that. I think we need to do more to support low decile schools. I mean, they do a fantastic job in terms of the education they provide, but they are incredibly overstretched and overworked. We really need to be supporting those schools much better to address burnout, make teaching easier. I also think there's a strong argument that, as it is in a country like Germany, tertiary education should be free. Yes, there is a private benefit to tertiary education, but to the extent that people experience that, we should be capturing that through the tax system, through increased income taxes, higher income tax rates. I mean, we could even have a graduate tax if you like, but what we should not be doing is charging people up front for it, I think. Especially given the existence of cultures within New Zealand where getting into debt is taboo, is regarded as inappropriate. I also think we should be moving towards free healthcare. Now, we are a very long way away from that, so that's pretty ambitious. But, you know, I've lived in the UK, I've seen the benefits of a health system that is completely free at the time of need, at the point of delivery. We already have free healthcare for certain groups in society. Let's start incrementally increasing the number of people who can access free healthcare. And finally, I think we should be, in welfare terms, looking at something like a guaranteed minimum income. Now you could see this as part of addressing wealth inequality at source, but it's also about supporting people at the bottom end so well that whatever advantages wealthy people have, they're relatively insignificant. And a guaranteed minimum income would be to say we should be paying the benefit at a much more generous rate, perhaps at the rate of New Zealand super, and we should be paying it unconditionally. So that if you're reliant, for whatever period on the state, you should have an income that guarantees you a life of some minimum kind of dignity. Now that's been a pretty rapid sort of whistle-stop tour through some of the solutions, but of course there is more detail in the book itself, and here comes the unsubtle plug. Yeah, all of this, everything I've been talking about is fleshed out in the book itself, and it is through the purchases of books that independent researchers and indeed independent publishers are sustained. So if you found this interesting, please do go out and purchase the book. It's available in bookstores like the wonderful Unity, just down below us, also online at the BWB website. But either way, thank you very much for joining us, and I'll hand over now to Joe.
Oh, okay. I just can't. I'll make the mouse work. Oh, there we go. It's working now. Sweet. Thanks. Tēnā koutou katoa. My name's Jo Spratt. I'm the Comms and Advocacy Director at Oxfam Aotearoa, and it's lovely to be here with you all today and to make some comments on Max's book. I'm going to make 4 broad areas of comment, and I'm bringing a global perspective to that, which I'm kind of hoping you'd be expecting from someone who works at Oxfam. So I'll speak about global wealth and how it continues to concentrate amongst a few, similar to the trend that Max found in his book. I'll comment on how the coronavirus pandemic and the climate crisis are deepening the structural inequalities that already exist, and particularly because of what wealth gets you, which is another key theme in Max's book. And then I'll just conclude touching on a few solutions in a far less comprehensive way than Max did. Similar to Max, Oxfam's philosophy is that you can't understand poverty and inequality without understanding wealth. They're two sides of the same coin. And we've spent many years now looking at global wealth on an annual basis. And what Max finds in his research echoes what we've found across the world at the global level. Over the last 40 years, we've found that the richest 1% of the global population have captured more of the proceeds of economic growth than the poorest half of humanity combined. That's like over 3 billion people. And you can see from the slide here that over time, billionaires, at the global level we're talking about billionaires, have increased in number, which is the green bar, as well as in their wealth, which is the orange line. Now, this is a few years old now. It finishes in 2017. The trend has continued, I can assure you. I just don't have a graph to show it. But, of course, we're all wondering what happened during the coronavirus pandemic. And to some degree, it might be a bit early. But what we found looking at last year was that while there were initially losses for all, like there was that big crash when the pandemic really broke early last year. Gosh, it was last year, wasn't it? The richest 1,000 people on the planet recouped their losses within 9 months. Further, the 32 largest corporations were anticipating to make excess profits during the pandemic. So that's profits on top of the normal profits they were expecting to make. Good old Jeff Bezos at Amazon, who we love to pick on, he made so much that he could have paid all of his almost 900,000 employees a US $100,000 bonus and still end up with more than he had at the start of the pandemic. Like, it's just insane. No. Are you crazy? His ex-wife's doing quite a good job of giving away a lot, which is great to see. But anyway, doesn't compensate for not paying taxes. Anyway, we've also seen 9 new billionaires made off the back of the COVID-19 vaccine. And both Pfizer and Moderna collectively are projecting to make $60 billion next year off the vaccine alone. Like all corporates, these profits go to people who are already mostly wealthy. So in the lead up to the pandemic, the 32 most profitable companies paid out $1.3 trillion to their shareholders. And in the first 8 months of the pandemic, they paid out 94% of their profits, which was $195 billion, to their shareholders. So that doesn't leave very much to help their workers who were, in the midst of a coronavirus pandemic, struggling, or investing in their companies, or protecting the environment, or anything else. All went to wealthy individuals, pretty much. And meanwhile, in contrast to the fact that those 1,000 richest people made their losses back in 9 months, the estimates are that for the poorest people on Earth, it could take up to a decade to recover, if at all. And we have pretty credible, well, not pretty credible, IMF, World Bank, everybody's predicting an increase in extreme poverty. And I think we've probably seen it, but we just don't have the measurement to state it unequivocally. So this all speaks to one of the key, for me, it speaks to one of the key themes in Max's book, which is what wealth can get you. We see that wealth gives people a buffer. It gives them resilience to weather the storm and still come out on top. But it also gives them a way of avoiding some of the risks to begin with. So while some of the wealthiest people on Earth were doing okay during the pandemic, the poorest were losing their jobs and struggling to get by. People who experience poverty, as Max says on the last page of his book, are more likely to live in crowded housing and globally with limited safe water and sanitation, if any. And they tend to work in essential but precarious and poorly paid jobs, all of which puts them at greater risk of contracting COVID-19. And that's precisely what we saw across the world. Mortality rates from COVID-19 were higher amongst people who experience poverty. Wealth gets you the ability to buy your own oxygen cylinder, to get private health services, and the space to isolate yourself away from others and get people to bring you food so you don't have to go out and find it for yourself and your family. What wealth gets you also relates to the situation with the climate crisis. The wealthy can afford to avoid or protect themselves from the worst impacts. They can air condition their homes when the temperatures soar. They can choose to live where they want, away from places prone to flooding and landslides. And they can afford the best quality insurances or have savings for when things go wrong. But the point I want to emphasise here is that the wealthy are disproportionately responsible for the climate crisis because of their lifestyles. Last year, with the Stockholm Environment Institute, Oxfam assessed the global distribution of consumption emissions amongst individuals from 1990 to 2015. And what we found was that the wealthiest 10% of people on the planet drove the rapid acceleration of total emissions over the past 25 years, while the poorest people didn't benefit at all from expanded consumption. Even only the richest 1% created more emissions than the entire poorest 50% of humanity. So we've got this lovely dinosaur graph, which doesn't need much explaining, but you can see on the left-hand side the poorest 5% of the global population, and on the right the richest 5%, and up the side the share of growth in total carbon emissions. So you can see who's contributing the most quite blatantly there. So the wealthy are rapidly depleting our finite global carbon budget if we want to stay within 1.5 degrees of global warming, leaving next to no space for the world's poorest households to gain any benefits from the remaining carbon budget. And that brings me to my final reflections on solutions. And Max talked about a wealth tax, or some kind of tax on wealth, which I certainly agree of the need for this. But I think we also need to be taxing behaviours that wealthy people practice, which drive the climate crisis. So the emissions of the richest are largely driven by flying, by buying more polluting cars and driving them further. So we can tax these behaviours and then use the funds for just transitions, to invest in social protection for people who might lose their job, green jobs, public education, things like this. But I think more generally we need to be talking far more about our tax system as a powerful tool to prevent and reduce inequality. What this really is a conversation about sharing and the kind of society we want to live in. And Max discusses this to quite some degree in his book, the idea of a greater sense of collectivism, that we're all in this together and we need to grow care and compassion for one another. And I thought this graph, it's not that clear, sorry, but I mean, it's clear enough, you get the gist of the declining taxes of rich individuals and corporations over the years from 1970 to 2010. It shows that one of our key mechanisms for expressing care for one another and for achieving collective well-being, our tax system, is not working to achieve those goals. Tax systems across the world have become rigged to support the concentration of wealth, and I think this graph shows that really well. And what this highlights is the influence that wealthy people and corporations have over government decisions. Because the wealthy also tend to be more politically connected, more educated and better networked, a class of their own, as Max highlights, this means they possess great power to protect their interests over those of others. And I think many of the solutions that Max outlines are really awesome solutions. The challenge is, how do you get them put into practice when you do have a wealthy elite who will be working hard to prevent anything that works against their interests? I quite like the idea of some sort of, I don't know, study tour sounds really wrong, but doing something to support wealthy people to engage more with people who are not wealthy in a meaningful way. That quote about the millions, not tens of millions in terms of inheritance, shows just how divorced from reality that some wealthy people can be. But I do think that the key countervailing force to concentrated power is collective power for the common good. The kind of power that takes time to build, perseverance, careful conversations, commitment, and all pulling together for a better world. Using thoughtful, considered, informed approaches. And I think Max's work contributes to this endeavour by enriching us all with knowledge and challenging us to think about these sometimes uncomfortable class divisions in society. I know it took a lot of work, but it was definitely worth it. It is an excellent read, and I definitely suggest you buy one. And I'm grateful, Max, that you took the time to write it. So thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Joe and Max. Andre, do we have another mic, or just me? No, but okay. So now, time for any questions, comments, thoughts, discussion. Who would like to start?
Your sound on this microphone for the audience.
Right. Anybody wish to start? Yes. I'll give you the mic.
Oh.
You mentioned economists were able to predict or say they can look back and say that this is going to happen. Do you think Roger Douglas thought this would happen?
I mean, in a way, there's probably other people in the room better placed than I to answer that, because I wasn't around at the time. I think I mean, very often people think that what they're doing is going to improve things, even when it's not going to. And I certainly think, yeah, I mean, I think among other things, Douglas was operating. I mean, there was two things. One, it was all extremely cynical. You know, he's admitted since that they deliberately did the reforms as quickly as possible so that people couldn't keep up. You know, so explicitly anti-democratic. He also, and I read one of his books once, and he said that he genuinely thought that when they sacked thousands of people from the Forestries Corporation, which, you know, admittedly probably was overstaffed, that those people would go on to become forestry-based entrepreneurs. You know, he really thought that that's what forestry workers were going to go out and do, that they, with no help from anyone or the state, they were suddenly going to transform themselves into these incredible sort of business people. So whatever else he thought was going to happen, he was just, yeah, not totally connected to reality.
Well, I can possibly help with that. Just to tell this story, I was working for the Labour Party in 1984 when the fourth Labour government was elected. I started work about possibly 2 weeks before Robert Muldoon imbibed a bit too much whiskey on a night, and there was a crisis over with the Marilyn Waring over ships entering New Zealand ports. Anyway, not to go into too much detail, the day after the election, I went into the party office and found on the Labour Party photocopier a typed transcript of the Treasury's economic management, which was the blueprint for the economic revolution that Douglas implemented. And I think we have to see not just Roger Douglas, but a global change that started out of Chicago University. Many think some of those people were educated at Chicago that were in Treasury at the time, carried through by the Round Table. So we've seen a generation-long systematic program, which is resulting in the sort of statistics that Joe showed us of the concentration of wealth. So yes, those of us who were there around at the time can certainly add a bit more. Yeah, mate.
Paul Tillage. I was involved, like Smithy was, in the battles, and there was other here as I look around against the Roger Nines. And if you don't, it's not only Roger Douglas, there was Preble, there was Bassett, there, and there were a number of others. And I think the context was there was a lack of, after the Keynesian models, I think there was a lack of any real model. There was the sort of the end of the Soviet Stalinist sort of era, and then there came the Chicago School, and they were able to put it through just basically the university systems of the time and the American government of the time, and they pushed that whole ideology. And because of the state of Muldoon and some of the failures, of his policies, they were able to actually fill a vacuum. And I think they knew what they were doing, but the people behind them knew more. And one last thing I'll just say, I was working at the CTU at one particular time, and one of the people came back there from the CTU and meeting down at Treasury, and had an American there, Chicago School, and one of the people there, the economists, commented that what they'd been able to do here was what they were able to do in Chile, but without the blood and the tanks on the streets. And I think that very much gives you an idea of what was, basically put upon us. And I think that the battle of the politics has been to try and regain the momentum to move to more a progressive form of politics, which I think we've got we've got with Jacinda and Grant, and that more work to be done. I must say, I think your book is, I haven't read it, but your presentation was excellent. I think some of your solutions will have to work on, and I think it's a good contribution to the debate in each direction.
Okay, thank you.
From your interviews, if you became aware that people justify their wealth, that they believe they've got a right to it. I remember a journalist saying how they...
Pass the microphone. Oh, sorry, sorry. Yes.
Sorry.
It's all right.
Yeah, that rich people tend to justify their wealth. I remember a journalist saying that he works hard for his money, like a cleaner doesn't. And how do we challenge that? Like, if the only way you can sleep at night is to believe that you've earned these millions and millions of dollars, how do you change that thinking?
Yeah, I mean, it's a mixture. Inevitably, the only sort of wealthy people who wanted to talk to me were quite, the relatively progressive ones. So in the book, Hugh Fletcher, for instance, says, well, look, I had the luck of birth, and he's reasonably open about that. And he's a big fan of a land tax, doing something to really redistribute wealth, very anti the massive corporate salaries that are paid nowadays. More generally, there's this the just world theory is very powerful, right? People want to believe that the world they live in is just, because it's very destabilizing, very disturbing to think that the world might be profoundly unjust or chaotic, or that the rewards people end up with have got no connection to their values. So people do find all sorts of ways to justify their wealth, even when it's excessive. For me, the kind of the way to push back, I think, is there's a couple of things. You can just highlight. No one sees the world through one frame. We all are capable of seeing the world through different frames and acknowledging different things, and you need to appeal to those other bits, the better frames in people's minds, the less sort of self-centered ones. And I talk about this, kind of comes from Elizabeth Warren, but it's just that basic argument that if you have done well in New Zealand, yes, you may have worked hard in a number of cases, but you've also drawn deeply from a pool of collective resources that we've all provided, and Joe touched on that. You would have driven on roads that we all paid for. You would have used a state education system and a public healthcare system that was created by taxpayers and by previous generations. You'll be relying on the state's court system to enforce contracts. You'll be relying on ultra-fast broadband that we all funded. You have drawn deeply out of that well of collective resources, that pool, and if that resource is to be there for future generations, you have to replenish it. And so you have to put back into it. You have to pay your share of taxes so that all those resources and that infrastructure is there for future generations. Because we are entered into a compact that is multi-generational. We've inherited this world. We live with the fruits of the efforts of past generations. And so similarly, we are in a compact with future generations to ensure that that collective infrastructure is there so that they can thrive as well.
Yeah. I guess... at Oxfam, we always use your line, and when we get challenged that we're going after the wealthy people and they earned it, it's like, so a cleaner is working 2 jobs a day, doesn't earn it, doesn't work hard. But also, we did some research, I think in about 2018, and found that a vast amount of wealth, I can't remember the percentages, actually inherited or come from monopolies or cronyism, so it's not actually earned. But I also think we need to challenge the whole idea of what is wealth, and is wealth in sort of material assets really what we're aspiring for as a society? Because I do think there's that sense that it is, and that even people who aren't wealthy are aspiring towards earning that wealth. So I think we really need to get to the fundamental questions about what it is to be a human society and share it, live good lives together.
Thanks very much. Great book, great talk. I haven't read the book, but I'm beginning to. Thanks very much, Max. I just make a couple of observations. One, as a budding young economist, I was working in the Treasury in 1984 and saw the neoliberal revolution from the inside. I don't accept responsibility for the mistakes I made then, but I was always a bit sceptical, and there was a debate back then, but the neoliberals clearly won. in economic management, government management, and other, sort of publications that Treasury produced. But more importantly, I think that the obsession back then was around economic efficiency. And to some extent, it was a result of Muldoon's heavy-handed government approach, regulate everything, interest rates, incomes, price and wage freeze, and so on. So, the reaction to that was quite pronounced. And to the extent that New Zealand was freed up and opened up, I think there were some advantages to that, but it did go way too far in the neoliberal direction. However, without going into any more of that, I think what we've seen, and I think this is where it plays into what Joe's saying, is that the whole notion of developing higher incomes and wealth has been eclipsed has begun to be eclipsed. What are we trying to achieve this greater wealth for? And if you look environmentally, it's patently clear that humans are doing immense damage to the planet. I've been working on environmental issues for the last 30 years, and climate change is the example par excellence of that. But what lies beneath that climate change phenomenon is the ability of the wealthy to do enormous damage. So wealth, and refer George Monbiot, who's been talking about this for quite a while. The damage done by wealth is extraordinary, and so the whole point of a capitalist society to accumulate wealth is in question. It's in doubt, and in fact, I think there's a pretty good case that it's been a disastrous mistake in the history of humans on the planet. So yeah, I think that's the broader question behind what you've been tackling, Max. What's wealth for? How much damage is it doing? How can we reverse that predisposition towards accumulation of wealth, and yet maintain adequate living standards at the bottom, or improve them?
Video. We'll just take a couple more questions because and then we'll a couple more questions, then we'll finish up. So I had a question from Rachel. Oh, and one more, right? Two more.
I just wanted to ask whether a factor is the ongoing legacy of that period has been a certain resentment of the state, and how do you achieve the changes that are necessary if there is that sort of fear, possibly at both levels of your class system?
Okay, thank you. No, we're going to take the questions. Take notes.
Well, my question is very much in the same line. I grew up in. Sorry.
Hold it to your mouth.
Right there. Yeah. Good. That's better. Sorry. I grew up in Europe, in Austria in the 1950s, and yes, it was definitely a nice way of seeing a distribution of wealth, and people, working class people, are being able to only afford things that their parents could not even think of, and so on. But the problem is that I left Austria in the 70s, and the top tax rate then was 65%. My family complained bitterly 10 years later when the top tax rate had moved to 85%. My in-laws in England endured 90% tax rates, and in some combination of taxation, people ended up with a 105% tax bill. So I don't think it's at all a surprise that that could not last, because that's just ridiculous. And so therefore, we then had the Thatcher and the New Zealand version of Thatcher. And that's now obviously need correcting again in the other way. It's called a dialectic, is it?
Got it. One more down the back.
You make a very good point that New Zealand's... You can do it. Yeah, okay. I think you make a very good point that New Zealand's an outlier, not having taxes on capital gains, inheritance, Well, good. I mean, like, we happily tax every dollar that's clean as salary, but a landlord can flip a rental property for hundreds of thousands, if not, millions gains without taxing, and clearly that's not right. I was going to ask, what is the trick of actually convincing people about? I'm a fan of inheritance taxes in particular. They tax a lot of boxes. It's a windfall. It's probably the least justifiable form of inequality. But the problem is it's not very popular. And so, what is the trick for convincing people about the merits of an inheritance tax? The only effect is what the top couple of percent people. It won't affect the vast majority of people. For some reason, people think it may affect it, but in the vast majority of cases, it won't. And we had an inheritance tax for 130 years, and it's not an outlier. UK and US have inheritance taxes. So I am interested in how we could make the case for inheritance tax. I think it's a very strong case about how you make the political case.
And Judy, last question.
Yeah, Max, you had a figure about percentages of students from different deciles of schools that went to engineering and so on. I'm wondering whether in doing those calculations you factored in the fact that the lower the decile of the school, the smaller it is. There's been a huge move towards the higher decile schools, and they're the ones that have the enormous populations of students. But I was also going to say that I think if we're looking at for solutions, the rezoning work that the Ministry of Education is rather tentatively embarking on, especially in Auckland, does have the potential to kind of force people from the more wealthy suburbs to actually be educated alongside a more diverse population. But of course, the really wealthy, always have the escape of taking their kids right out of the state system and sending them to the private system. But at least they'd have to pay for that.
Right, okay, thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Just to say on, and it's nothing particularly insightful, but on trying to get people to support different types of taxes, I think it's extraordinarily difficult because tax is just a negative frame to start with. Like, most people think of it as a loss. So I think it really is trying to start the conversation at that deeper level around sharing and working together for collective wellbeing. Tax Justice Aotearoa and Oxfam are doing some scoping around a potential tax campaign, and hopefully we'll fund some messaging research. So come back to us in 18 months and maybe I'll have a better answer for you.
Cool, thanks. Okay, quite a few points here. Just briefly, Rafe, on your climate point, yeah, extremely well made. Also interesting to reflect on your experiences in the Treasury. I think I remember Russell Marshall, who was Education Minister, saying, about those debates within caucus. He said, well, Longy and Douglas and Prebble had all these arguments, and he said somewhere, and to be honest, we just didn't have much to push back against them with, because all they had was sort of a Keynesianism that had seemed to have failed by that stage and was discredited. So I do think one of the problems, we need to sort of assemble a new kind of way of doing things, a new sort of political economy. But it's difficult because you can't just rely on Marx anymore, or just rely on Keynes, or as the right to just rely on Milton Friedman plus Hayek. You have to assemble a huge range of thinking that's, Kate Raworth's stuff about the limits to growth, Mariana Mazzucato's stuff about, the role of the economy in driving innovation, Thomas Piketty's work on, wealth dynamics, all these sorts of things. But yeah, absolutely having environmental bottom lines at the heart of it. And yeah, and what Joe said, also rethinking what wealth is. And I talk a bit about wealth and well-being in the book, but didn't manage to get to that in the presentation. But yeah, you're right, it's obviously crucial. Second question, is there a resentment towards the state? Hard to measure. I think there is a bit. I think one of the problems and one of the reasons why I sort of push back against the politics of nostalgia is that I think egalitarianism got tarred with conformity. With the tall poppy syndrome, with levelling down, as someone, Leslie Lipson said, in its anxiety to raise minima, New Zealand decided that it also had to lower maxima as well, and was intolerant of talent and difference and that sort of thing. So I do think there is a sense in which we have to make clear that tackling inequality isn't about enforcing total equality. and it's not about conformity. Actually, you know, if you reduce poverty, for instance, then there's really good evidence that you get a big upsurge in entrepreneurship, for instance. There's lots of kids whose talents suddenly aren't wasted because through no fault of their own they get a terrible start in life. So you have to make it clear that equality is being pro-equality, is being pro-talent and diversity, but it's about those talents being put in the service of the collective good, not the individual good. What there also is, and this is really clear from focus group evidence, and I talk about this in the book, is there's not a lot of sort of pro-inequality sentiment, but there is huge skepticism that we can do anything about it. The one message of the 80s that has stuck, unfortunately, is that there's nothing much you can do about inequality. It's just the market. And what can you do about the market? Because the market is the market. So that view is quite embedded, or at least people have no arguments against it. And so we have to be better at telling stories about how collective action is successful, telling stories about how it's worked in the past, how it's reduced inequality. Your point about very high tax rates. Yeah, I mean, I don't think sort of tax rates in New Zealand were ever that excessive. I mean, the top income tax rate was 66%, but there wasn't a huge amount of sort of other taxes on top of that that would have given you those massive sort of marginal rates. There certainly were some things in New Zealand that needed correcting, and I think, and again, Rafe and Paul and others have alluded to this. You know, New Zealand was a very closed economy, but as I say in the book, making New Zealand a more open society didn't have to mean making it more unequal. You know, that was the connection that the Roger Nome's always made. It's like, oh, well, look, inequality is the price you pay, because we have to have a dynamic economy. We can't run this country like a Polish shipyard, you know, David Longhi's quote. But there's no logical connection between those two things. You can have an open, dynamic society like Denmark, not that it's perfect, but it's much more egalitarian than we are. But I think you're absolutely right. We have to see all these things moving as forces that move against each other. Joe's talked about how we convince people about taxation and things. Inheritance taxes are a really hard sell, unfortunately. I think, you know, wealth taxes, pure wealth taxes on net worth are unpopular. But if you want to find the one thing that's even less popular, it's an inheritance tax, unfortunately. Which seems crazy because, like you, I think it is the tax with the strongest justification from a fairness. But people have just really become convinced that they have to be able to hand something down to their kids. And of course, inheritance taxes don't stop ordinary people doing that. But in people's minds, just the conversation just always goes, you know, but I want to hand the house on to my kids when I die. You know, and that's... Yeah.
Most of the world is.
But yeah. Oh no, I know, and I know that, and you know that. But people don't see that. So that would probably be a starting point. You would have to say, you know, a upper end inheritance tax or something just to get over that hurdle. Finally, on the stuff around engineering, I was relying totally on Kirsty Johnston's research for the Herald a few years ago, which was brilliant. But that's her work, not mine. Totally, very well. I mean, I do also discuss the white flight and more generally the flight from Decile 1 schools from multiple ethnicities, which is a point you make very well, and I certainly won't be adding anything to your stock of knowledge about that, but it is an incredibly powerful force in a negative sense, that belief that Decile 1 schools, you know, should be avoided because they're stigmatised. That link that's made between the poverty of the intake and the supposed poverty of the teaching, which of course is completely false. Yeah, and I agree with you about the rezoning. You know, it's interesting. Christchurch schools have, you know, sort of agreed between them. I've written about this and stuff. Have agreed to kind of stop poaching each other's students. So, you know, there's some stuff that's quite good that's voluntary, but the people in Christchurch said, yeah, but, you know, it'd be tough to get this happening in Auckland because the dynamic is even worse in Auckland. And so you're right, the ministry is looking at forcibly rezoning. Will they ever touch the grammar zone, though? I mean, that's like a live wire. And, you know, what was it Tim O'Connor, the head of Auckland Grammar, said? He said, like, you know, parents have spent millions of dollars on homes so they can be in the grammar zone, you know, and won't they feel gypped if the zone is redrawn? And I'm like, can we find the world's tiniest violin for these people? Because honestly, that is not a problem that bothers me in the slightest.
Okay, well thank you very much, Max and Joe. Just to wrap up, I think one of the key things about doing anything about this is the issue of voice. And I think that slide there summarises the problem of voice that the majority don't have much in the way of voice. So one of the things Max talked about, and I do know a bit about this sort of thing, is issue of political donations. And it just so happens that currently there is a consultation process out to look at political donations. And the two things they've highlighted are the fact that the limit for disclosure was being raised from $10,000 a few years ago up to $15,000, which actually makes it quite easy to aggregate incomes to produce quite sizable donations. And also the other issue is the use of auctions, and I know about that one. And I remember having to say, my God, I've got to tell the artists that it's their names that are going into the disclosure statement, which was a strange thing I thought at the time, but that's, I think, about to be remedied, and rightly so. So what I'm saying is there is an opportunity right now for voice, and there won't be much in the way of submissions to that consultation, I suspect, but I would like to urge everybody to get in there, because the other thing that can be raised is the one that Max did raise, and I think would get some support, of a cap on, on donations at all. And I absolutely agree with him. The Canadian system, in my opinion, is much more preferable than what we have and what we have had for years. So that's anyway, reinforcing that part of your book, Max. So once again, thank you very much. Happy Christmas, happy COVID New Year, and we'll see you in the new year.